Welcome to the Food Startups Podcast, connecting the opaque world of food startups.
This is Daniel Imri Sitanayaka of Tiny Farms, and you are listening to the Food Startups Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to the 75th episode of the Food Startups Podcast. Today we're going to talk about doing the unscalable things. It's a book called Unscalable, and the author is a really brilliant recent Stanford grad who got into Y Combinator. And for those of you who don't know about Y Combinator, it's like the top incubating program in Silicon Valley with Paul Graham, who's a legendary investor in Airbnb and a number of other projects. And we kind of go behind the scenes of all of the incredible effort and dirty work that a startup needs to do to get off the ground, you know, the quote unquote unscalable things. So I think there's a lot to learn here and a really objective look at the reality and difficulty of the startup world. Enjoy the show. He's based in the San Francisco Bay Area. In the heart of the world he portrays. A software engineer by trade, he has also founded two companies. While going to undergrad at Stanford, he founded the education tech company ClassAl, which partnered with a Stanford kind of incubator program and was sold by his co-founders this year. And then he launched a second company, Fan Hero, which was accepted into Y Combinator, which is the most prestigious startup accelerator by Paul Graham. Some of the listeners will probably know that, some won't, but you know that's like Airbnb. That's like the big time accelerator program in Silicon Valley. And he is recently an author of a book that's coming out this January called Unscalable. Charlie Gawo, how's it going, man?
Good. Thanks so much for having me, Matt.
Yeah, Charlie, I gotta say, I really like the book, but first things first, why are you in Australia?
So I suppose I am just really bad at staying in one place for a long time. And I'm very, very lucky that I have a skill set that I'm able to take on the road, right? So I can do, I do contract projects and rather than paying, $3,500 a month for an apartment in San Francisco, I can go to Sydney or Buenos Aires or London. Well, maybe not London, but, I can go elsewhere.
That's awesome. And so have you read The 4-Hour Workweek?
I have. And I think it has been a huge inspiration for me for trying to build this sort of lifestyle.
That's awesome. So kind of a funny anecdote. I was reading a book called Status Anxiety by Alain de Botton. He's like a modern day philosopher from England. And he mentions there's a book that came out in 1907, 100 years before the 4-Hour Workweek, called 3 Acres and Liberty. And it was written by a guy on the East Coast saying, you should just move to the Midwest where land is cheap, and I'll teach you to have a sustainable farm, 3 acres. You and your family can live on that, and you have like a much better life. So it was kind of like the 4-Hour Workweek of the 20th century.
That's amazing. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I'll send you the link. It's like everyone thought the 4-Hour Workweek was the first of its kind, but I guess a lot of things in history repeat themselves. But listen, Charlie, before we get into the book, I want to find out a little bit more about you. Did you grow up in California?
No, I grew up in Chicago, which for the record, I think is a hugely underrated city. And when I was a teenager, my dad's job moved us out to the East Coast where I did high school, and then I went to, as you said, I went to Stanford. So I moved out to California then and sort of stuck around post graduation.
Awesome. And how old were you when you learned to program?
Let's see. I think my first programming class. So I was really fortunate in that I went to a high school that required you to take a computer science course. And to be honest, I probably would not have discovered it for years if it hadn't been for that high school. And I did that my sophomore year. So I would have been probably around 15, I think. And to be honest, I put off taking that class for as long as I could, because I thought I had this misconception that programming was going to be like IT, that I was going to be figuring out how to do Microsoft Word and how to reset the computer. And I was so adamant that I was going to hate computer science. But when I took the class, finally, I just absolutely fell in love with it.
That's awesome. And I see a theme. I guess just like a lot of things, though, it's such an advantage if you start coding when you're a teenager as opposed to when you're, let's say, 25. Not that I'm not saying it's impossible by any means, but it's just when you're a young kid and you're learning it, it really makes you really agile and rapidly can learn new languages and platforms, et cetera, et cetera?
I think the syntax and the structure, maybe is easier to pick up when you're younger. But I definitely think anyone, if you haven't tried it before, should give it a go. I sort of explained it to friends as if you like solving logic puzzles, you will probably like programming.
Right on. Cool. So you're at Stanford, right? And you entered this program and you started your first company, ClassAl. And what is ClassAl?
Yeah, so ClassAl was originally a way to help students just keep track of everything that they had to do, right, for school. Because we had this problem of constantly asking ourselves, what is due tomorrow, right? Like, what do I need to take care of right now, or maybe a couple days in advance that I'm forgetting. And so we built a system that operated a little bit like a Twitter feed. Right. And classes that you followed would push, meeting events, homework events, things like that into this feed, and it would organize it for you in a way that you could see what was coming up. Over time, we added features like being able to review classes and for professors, collecting feedback from students on how long it took to complete assignments.
Gotcha. And then I guess this was pretty much right out of school. Or within a year of getting out of school, you got into Y Combinator. What was your pitch like to Paul Graham and Associates?
Yeah, that was a bit of a fun time. So I'm happy to talk about it, but all of this, the Y Combinator story is actually available in a sorted dramatic Medium post. It's called "How I Crashed and Burned in Y Combinator." If any of your listeners want to go check out the full thing,
perfect. We'll definitely link to that.
At least for our pitch, we went in with actually a separate idea from Fan Hero. And we went in and we sat down in the room. We'd prepared for hours and hours. And we had sort of one set of partners that was not Paul Graham, that was not Jessica Livingston. It was some of the other guys. And we sat down and they grilled us. And we actually thought we did a pretty good job, right? We'd read a lot about how awful these YC interviews were, how grueling they were. But we thought we had pretty good answers. And we actually felt really confident walking out of the interview room. And then we started to drive home. And we got about halfway back to the campus before my phone started ringing. And I picked it up, and it was somebody from YC. And they told us, you did great, good interview, but we'd actually like to bring you back to do a second interview, to talk to a different set of partners. And this freaked us out a little bit because we had, I guess now it's become more common, but we had never heard of people doing multiple interviews before. And so we rescheduled. We were planning to just not worry about the rest of our day, go do laundry, whatever. But instead we went back, we crammed for another 4 hours, and then we drove back to YC. And we sat down, and this time we had a different set of partners. This time we did have Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston, and the heavy hitters. And we sat down, and it just went so horribly. I remember a moment where Paul Graham just let out a sigh and rubbed his forehead, and he said, "We're 2 minutes into your 10-minute interview, and I still have no idea what your company does. This is not good."
Oh man, that's gotta raise the internal panic button. Huh?
Yeah, and and we were just trying to explain, what we did and who we were and the product, and I don't know, we kind of trudged through the 10-minute interview. And by the end, we walked out. We were so dejected, drove home. We're just so convinced that we weren't going to get it, and we just waited. And shockingly, we got the phone call, right? We got so they call you the day of your interview. They will call you that night if you got in, right? And they decide the same day, every day. And we got the call, and they told us we were in, and we were just so shocked.
Wow. So you must have done something in those last 8 minutes to win Paul Graham back, or I don't know. So that's cool that you guys redeemed yourself. So cool. And so Fan Hero, I guess, it crashed and burned, and now you're kind of, working, I guess, on contracts, doing programming, kind of looking for the next project, or do you already have a startup that in mind?
I don't know that I have anything in mind. I ended up doing YC, and the company didn't go great. And I think in part of that, it really drove home this, I guess, sort of belief that I have that I don't want to do a company for the sake of doing a company, right? I think when I find an idea that really resonates with me, that I'm willing to give up my time, my energy, my travel schedule for, right? Then I'll sit down and get to work on it. But nothing has quite swayed me yet.
Well, that sounds like a great mindset. And I think a misconception that a lot of people have is like the average age of successful founders, which I think is like 38 years old. So you have plenty of time to get more experience, travel, and, fine tune ideas and what you like before you do that, right? But I'm guessing you're going to make another run at it just on how quickly you went out of the gates out of Stanford. But Charlie, let's go into the book, Unscalable. So I got I guess I got a couple questions. First off, Unscalable, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'd say it's around the theme of kind of doing the dirty work, things that aren't necessarily systems and processes, but going the extra mile to get your startup off the ground, kind of debunking the idea that you put up the website. There are some brick and mortar businesses in the book, but a lot of times they're like websites or apps, and all of a sudden you have 100,000 users. That's very unlikely to happen. You kind of have to really kind of baby the first users and provide an unbelievable level of customer service, sometimes working like 20 hours a day. So, I mean, that's what I got, from as a theme of your book. So my question for you is, why should someone read Unscalable?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think you should read it if you like good stories. To be honest, it's actually a little bit surreal to see my name on the cover of a book. I'm a developer at heart, and publishing a book was never something that I thought was part of my plan. But when I started traveling, when I left YC to find myself, I suppose, I really started to become focused on this idea of where had I gone wrong, right? What had I not done that other people had that put them closer on a path to success? And obviously there's no guarantee of success when it comes to startups, but what had upped their odds over mine? And I started talking to people, and once I started talking to people, I stumbled, I think, across an interesting theme, which is that for the vast majority of startups, just on the inside, everything is on fire. Everyone is running around trying to put out fires before the whole building can burn down, right? And even I think the big ones, right, the ones that look glamorous and sexy from the outside are just kind of scrambling to make things work before it all goes kaput. And to me, when I started reading these stories, like the story about the delivery company founder who, quote unquote, borrowed $30,000 worth of copies from his university, or the CEO of a video chat app who slept on the floor with one headphone in so he could wake up and make sure his users logging in at 4 a.m. had a good experience. Or the two guys who dressed in like green suits and took a giant banner that said, "Ask us about free parking," and stood outside of SFO for a day.
And Charlie, let me just interrupt you there. So just so you know, I had been reminded of Flight Car. That was Flight Car, right? And so you know, I remember like maybe it was 3 or 4 years ago. It wasn't like last year or the year before. I remember looking at a random article in the Washington Post how these kids, they were like in high school, are going to start this service. And I read it and I was like, that's awesome. I wish them luck. And I completely forgot about it until I read your book today. And now I see it's like it's in LA, it's at Dulles Airport in Austin. So I plan on using it next year. But it was like really cool for me to like see that they're still around, because I'm sure like that type of business, going to airports and competing in rental cars, has got to be a lot. There's tons and tons of internal fire. I'm sure it's a lot of toil just to be even existing today.
Absolutely. And I think, those sorts of stories, those are what I love about Silicon Valley, right? About startups. And I guess I wanted to show other people this thing that I discovered, which was that, it's not glamorous, right? It's not easy. And you have to be willing to put in the hard work to make the machine go. Beyond that, I think there are some really good insights, some valuable strategies that are in there. Although you'd probably be a better judge of that than I would. But
definitely.
Yeah.
Like, Charlie, just so you know, the episode that we're publishing today, today is December 10th, was Index Ventures, which is like a huge VC fund that was like the leader of a round of $100 million for Deliveroo, which is kind of like the European and Asian version of DoorDash. They're actually in Australia, so you should try them, Deliveroo. And he gave some of those same stories. So it's pretty universal. And Charlie, I wanted to ask you a question since you've been part of Y Combinator, but in general in Silicon Valley, I think today entrepreneurship is viewed kind of like in a very romantic light, but it wasn't always that way. I mean, what percentage of startups fail?
I don't know that anyone really knows, but most people assume that it's a vast, vast majority, right? And there are different definitions of failure, I think, for everyone. There's just outright, it goes bankrupt. There's we shut it down. There's we go into zombie mode for 6 months and then sort of let it fade into obscurity. Then, some people also consider like an acqui-hire a failure, right? Which, if listeners don't know that term, it's a combination of being acquired and being hired, which is to say that you sell your company basically for parts and you just get a nice signing bonus from Google or Facebook or whatever large company is buying you. So the idea that you're going to start a company and make it $1 billion company as sort of a plan, right, is a bit like saying, my career strategy is to win the Powerball. It's just extremely, extremely unlikely.
Right. And it's, I'm not taking any credit away from the Ubers and the Facebook or anything, but there is an element of luck. Like Zenefits, which is kind of like a online HR services, payroll, insurance and everything. You mentioned that in one chapter. I think there was, there's over 10 startups, like 13 or 14 startups, and Zenefits plus DoorDash, but mostly Zenefits. I think Zenefits on its own is, their market capital is way more than all the other ones combined. So it's kind of being, I guess, surrounding yourself. There is a luck factor in the amount of success and amount of growth that you're going to have.
Well, yeah, I think I should also mention, having said that, right, when I started the book, the people I interviewed, none of them were $1 billion companies, right? And now, so it's taken me about a year, and now a year later, there are 2 certified $1 billion ones. It looks like DoorDash will probably hit $1 billion valuation in the near future, and possibly also a 4th too, which is, to me, just a bit insane how fast things grow in Silicon Valley.
So like GitHub is the other one?
Yeah, GitHub is they were previously worth, I think, like maybe 400 million, and then in the last year they announced that they'd raised additional funding at a $2 billion valuation.
Wow, and what's the 4th one that may come up into $1 billion?
I don't want to make any predictions or make any calls that people hold me accountable for, but I could see probably Tilt, I think, is joining that club too.
Wow, and are any of them in danger of going out of business? I guess there was one that already failed, which was 99 Dresses. But are there any ones that you interviewed a year ago that are in dire straits right now?
That's a good question. I think I don't know that there are any that are sort of facing immediate death, but I always find it interesting. I think the ones that you don't hear from a long time, right? The ones that you use regularly, but you have to ask yourself, like, what's new about this company? What's new about this product, right? Generally, if you're not making forward progress, that's not a great sign.
It's interesting. I need to look through my guests. I know some that are really growing quite quickly, and there may be some that, just the nature of the beast that are fading out. So that's really interesting to me that something like Zenefits. And Zenefits was really interesting to me because, so Charlie, like, all of us cannot stand sending faxes, especially the younger generation, right? And it was really interesting to me in I'm not going to tell all the anecdotes because you should read the book, but I thought about Zenefits where they say, all of these insurance brokers, they would just tell you to fax everything in, not because that had to be done, but it was just easy for them because they didn't have to do anything. They just made the sale and then you would be stuck sending faxes, which they said is a nightmare where it's like, I guess 90% of the time it works. And then the other 10% of time, causes like 80% of your customer support. So they kind of put in a workflow where they would send the fax and then call and make sure it was received, like a process for that. And that to me was just like another example of going the extra mile, right? Like if you're going to do a startup and just say, okay, UPS is going to deliver your order and just like leave it at that, you have to be on top of all these things. And like the Murphy's Law, like everything will go wrong. I've been seeing that myself right now as we're growing in the US. And I think that's another good lesson. So really reality and understanding the concept of unscalable, how far you have to go to make these things work. So I think that's another great thing you can get out of the book. I guess I wanted to go into, I believe this was this DoorDash with the copies at Stanford?
Yeah.
So, all right. So just listeners, this is a really awesome story. So they had to, to get restaurants to sign up for DoorDash, which is an on-demand, restaurant delivery service. They had to use a lot of flyers, just drop flyers everywhere. And they said for color flyers to print 100,000, it would have been about like $30,000. They didn't have the money. So they basically were able to use Stanford's library, right? And print it all in Stanford's library. But they're like, that's the difference between us not having any money and now it's, $1 billion company. So it's really amazing, all these like kind of moments of truth and what the founders will do to keep the company going.
And I think back then, they had no idea how big the company could get, right? To them, it was this experiment named PaloAltoDelivery.com. And they were just saying, all right, like, let's prove this concept out. Let's just see this, like, what is the smallest experiment that we can run that we can test whether or not this works as a business? And it was just getting orders from over a Google form and driving them to people on campus. And the next step was then, okay, like maybe we should try to get some wider presence and maybe some more funding. And it was, okay, how do we get the word out? And it was, okay, we need flyers. How do we print these for cheap? And then it was, all right, well, we'll use the library.
Yeah. And Charlie, so it's interesting too, because they obviously got a lot of funding, but I guess GitHub was more a bootstrap model. And we have a mix of bootstrapped and funding not only guests, but listeners to the show. So it's another thing that you point out in there is you don't have to get funding from a VC or angel investor to make a company work.
Absolutely. I think, there are a lot of things I love about Silicon Valley, but I think one of the things that I don't is this, among some people, especially, when you just take the tech press at face value, is this belief that the only way to do a company is to do the venture funded, rocket ship unicorn model. And that is not at all a one size fits all model, right? That there are dozens and dozens of ways for you to build your company. And many of them do not involve taking venture capital money.
Right. And it's like with venture capital, they either want you to become like, the way I understand it, like $1 billion company or fail quickly so they can invest in the next one. So if like you could build over 5 years to like an $8 million or $10 million a year solid company where you provide a great value to clients and your employees, they're not really that interested in that.
Absolutely. Because it's go big or go home for them because they have to return, most of their investments fail. So the ones that succeed need to pay for the ones that have failed. Right. And so if there is an exit that is good for you, right, personally on the scale of a couple $1 million, but not good for the fund because it's not on the scale of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, right, then oftentimes you can't take that exit.
Right on. Now, Charlie, I got another question for you. See if you can decide here. What is your favorite practical lesson from the book?
Ooh, that's tough. I think, I think it would be that if you have a piece of software, right, and you have never just taken a stranger, preferably, one who's used your software, but if necessary, even one that's not, even someone you just get off of Craigslist, and sat them down and just told them to use the software for half an hour, right? And just to mind dump everything that they're thinking as they're using it. I think that one exercise can reveal more usability problems than weeks of you just thinking about, oh, where should this button go? And what color should this header be? Because it'll reveal that this guy sits down and the things that are obvious to you that are like, how do I create a new account, right, are completely non-obvious to new users.
Right on. And so I guess in your life, how are you going to apply that lesson? Will you apply that to future startups, or could you see that as like a lesson for other things in life?
Definitely will apply to other startups. I mean, I think in life that just teaches you that your perspective is different, right? And you should try to get other people's perspectives when possible because they give you a more balanced view of the world around you, which is, I think, in part why I travel.
That's cool. So Charlie, I guess one other thing I wanted to mention about the book is there was a quote, and it's, the cost of starting these businesses is plummeting, but the cost of building these businesses is skyrocketing. So that to me was really interesting because it's like you said, I think in the intro, you can build a business over the weekend. A lot of these companies, they coded for 6 hours and they got their first landing page. But because of the lower barrier to entry, it also makes it tougher to grow and scale.
Absolutely. And I think, because the price of running the experiments has gone down so much, I think a lot of funding is moving towards the later stages. And especially in things like consumer applications, you need to be able to capture the market. You need to be able to establish a monopoly, I think, as quickly as possible. And I think that's becoming an even harder challenge. And I think that's why you're seeing Uber and Lyft raise hundreds of millions of dollars. Currently the delivery companies like DoorDash and I think Postmates and Instacart in the space are raising on the order of tens of millions because they want to capture. They've proven out the core model, at least on a small scale, and now they're trying to capture a monopoly.
Kind of like the way Airbnb won out in their space.
Yeah, for sure. I think Airbnb was a little bit lucky though in that for the longest time nobody thought it was a good idea, and so it took I think a while for competitors to catch on and try to copy what they'd done.
Interesting. Well, Charlie, listen, where can our listeners find you online?
Absolutely. I am, probably best place to find me is on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Charlie R. Guo. And the book can be found at unscalablebook.com. Right now, pre-orders are available via my publishing company, Inkshares. But in January, it will be hitting bookstores and Amazon.
Great. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the show. A lot of great stuff here for our listeners, and I hope to have you back in the future.
Awesome. Would love to be back, and thanks again for having me.
Hey guys, thanks so much for listening. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, find us online at foodstartupspodcast.com.